Here is the real reason America just changed forever, and it is not the debt, and it is not inflation, and it is not anything happening inside this country. Something was revealed. For 80 years, American power rested on a threat that never had to be used, because everyone believed it. And then that belief was tested in public, and it did not hold. Meanwhile, here is what most Americans have no idea about. China is now the top trading partner to more than 120 countries. Not a handful. More than 120, including Japan, South Korea, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the largest external partner of the entire European Union. And roughly 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made on one island, by a company that produces about half of all the chips on Earth, sitting 100 miles off the coast of China. If that island stopped shipping for 5 days, global markets would convulse. Nobody would need to fire a shot. That is not a prediction. That is the arrangement we are currently living inside, and almost nobody has explained it to you. A threat only works until somebody makes you prove it. Let me start with the mechanism, because once you understand this one idea, the rest of it follows, and you will see it everywhere. Most power is not exercised, it is implied. Think about how the last 80 years actually worked. The United States rarely had to do very much, because the possibility that it might was enough. A country considering something would run the calculation, factor in the likely American response, and decide against it. No ships moved, no announcement was made. The outcome simply happened, invisibly, in somebody else's decision-making. That is the most efficient form of power there is, and it costs almost nothing to maintain as long as nobody tests it. The catastrophic risk in that arrangement is that it depends entirely on belief, and belief is only durable while it remains untested. The moment somebody makes you demonstrate it, one of two things happens. Either you demonstrate it and the belief is reinforced for another generation, or you cannot, and the belief evaporates permanently, everywhere, at once. There is no partial credit. You cannot mostly enforce a threat. Now apply that to what has actually happened. The Strait of Hormuz is the most important energy choke point on the planet. A significant share of the world's seaborne oil passes through a channel that narrows to about 21 miles across. For decades, the operating assumption in every capital in the world was simple, that strait stays open because the United States will not permit otherwise. Nobody had to verify that. It was ambient. It was priced into insurance rates and shipping contracts and national energy planning. And then it was tested. What the world observed was not a lack of American capability. Let me be very clear about that, because it matters. The United States has the most capable military on Earth, and nothing about that changed. What the world observed was the constraint. It observed that the American public is intensely sensitive to gasoline prices, that the American public will not tolerate casualties for an objective it cannot articulate, that there is an election calendar and a leadership that has to consider it, and therefore that there is a ceiling on how much pain the United States can absorb before domestic politics forces a change of course. That ceiling is the actual information. Capability was never the question. Willingness was, and now willingness has a number attached to it. And here is why this cannot be walked back. If a country believed you would act and then watched you hesitate, it does not return to the prior belief when you later act decisively. It has permanently updated. It now knows that your response is conditional, and it will spend the rest of its planning life probing where those conditions bind. That is what people mean when they say a light bulb went off. Not that something was built or destroyed, that something was learned by everybody, simultaneously, and cannot be unlearned. The British went through the identical experience at Suez in 1956, and historians treat that moment as the definitive end of Britain as a first-rank power, not because Britain lost a battle. Because Britain discovered in public that it could no longer act without permission, and everyone else discovered it at the same moment. Britain did not become poorer that week. It became known. And I want to sit on that word for a second, because it is the whole idea. Britain's economy was the same on Tuesday as it had been on Monday. Its factories, its navy, its population, its resources, all identical. What changed was what everyone else believed about it, and that belief was the thing that had been doing the work. Power that rests on belief is enormously efficient and enormously fragile at the same time, and most people never notice the second half until the demonstration happens. That is the real reason I would say America just changed. Not a policy. A revelation. And revelations are permanent in a way that policies are not. 90% of the world's advanced chips come off one island, and nobody has a plan B. Now let me show you the actual choke point, because everyone is looking at the Middle East, and the one that matters is somewhere else entirely, and the numbers are genuinely difficult to believe until you check them. Taiwan produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, not 90% of some category. 90% of the leading-edge chips that go into every phone, every data center, every modern vehicle, every piece of AI infrastructure, and a great deal of military hardware. And within that, one company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, manufactures roughly half of all the semiconductors on Earth. TSMC and Samsung together account for something on the order of 70% of global foundry revenue, meaning contract chip manufacturing for other companies. TSMC is not a household name in most American homes, and it makes the chips inside the products of companies that are Apple, Nvidia, AMD, Qualcomm. Semiconductors represent roughly 13 to 15% of Taiwan's entire gross domestic product. Between 2018 and 2022, the output of that industry nearly doubled, from about $87 billion to about $162 billion. Taiwan's economy grew about 8.6% in 2025, which is a rate you associate with developing economies, not advanced ones. And it happened because of chips. And here is the milestone that tells you how fast this moved. In late 2025, the United States began importing more from Taiwan than from China. Taiwan passed Germany to become the fourth largest trading partner of the United States. The American goods trade deficit with Taiwan reached roughly $147 billion in 2025, about double the year before. Now hold that next to the geography. Taiwan sits about 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. So the most concentrated single point of failure in the modern global economy is located within easy reach of the country most likely to want leverage over it. And here is the part that I think almost nobody has thought through properly, because the conversation is always framed around invasion. Nobody has to invade anything. Consider a scenario that involves no war at all. Suppose shipping out of Taiwan were interrupted for 5 days, not bombed, not occupied, just interrupted through a quarantine, an inspection regime, an exercise that closes air and sea lanes, or simply enough ambiguity that insurers stop writing coverage and ships stop sailing. 5 days. Global equity markets would convulse immediately, because the earnings of a substantial share of the world's largest companies depend on that flow. Automakers would begin idling lines within weeks, and we already saw exactly that during the chip shortage a few years ago, when factories in Michigan sat still because of parts made on the other side of the world. Data center construction stalls, consumer electronics production stops, defense manufacturing is affected, and the point is that the mere credible ability to threaten that is itself the power. It never has to be used. It just has to be believed. Which brings us all the way back to the first idea in this video. That is a form of leverage that does not appear in any military balance sheet. You can count carriers and aircraft and warheads, and you will not find it because it is not a weapon. It is a dependency. Now, is anything being done? Yes, and it is worth being fair about. TSMC and other chip makers have committed enormous sums, upward of $250 billion by some accounting, to expand advanced manufacturing capacity in the United States. Fabs are being built in Arizona and elsewhere. That is real and it matters. But understand the timeline. A leading-edge fabrication plant takes years to construct and years more to reach yield. The workforce takes a decade to build. And the supply chain underneath it, the specialized chemicals, the gases, the equipment, the packaging and testing, is itself globally distributed and cannot be relocated by announcement. So the honest assessment is that the vulnerability is being addressed on a timeline of 10 to 20 years, and it exists right now. And one more thing that cuts against the simple version of this story. China accounts for roughly 60% of global semiconductor demand, and TSMC is one of its leading suppliers, which means the dependency runs both directions, and that mutual dependency is probably the single strongest force currently preventing anyone from doing anything catastrophic. That is not comfort exactly. It is a description of a standoff that holds because both sides would be gravely damaged, which is a stable arrangement right up until somebody miscalculates. And there is one more scenario worth understanding, because it is arguably the most likely one, and it gets almost no attention. Most commentary treats Taiwan as a binary. Either there is an invasion or there is not. But the analysis that seems most credible to me suggests the pressure is far more likely to be applied through economics and politics than through a landing force aimed at producing a negotiated reunification over years rather than a military conquest in weeks. Think about what that toolkit looks like. Trade dependency, since Taiwan's economy is deeply entangled with the mainland. Diplomatic isolation, chipping away at the small number of countries that maintain formal recognition. Information operations aimed at Taiwanese domestic politics. Periodic military exercises that impose costs and normalize the presence. investment, and business relationships that give Taiwanese firms a stake in accommodation. None of that is dramatic. None of it produces a headline that interrupts your evening, and all of it works slowly, in the direction of making the status quo feel less permanent and reunification feel more inevitable. That is a genuinely different threat model from the one most Americans carry in their heads, and it matters for one specific reason. A military invasion would trigger an obvious response, and everyone knows it. A 20-year campaign of gradual pressure has no moment at which anyone is obligated to do anything, which is precisely what makes it effective. And for you personally, it means the risk to your retirement account is not primarily a war headline. It is the slow repricing of an assumption. Markets currently price Taiwanese chip supply as reliable. If that assumption weakens gradually, the repricing is gradual too, and it shows up in the valuations of a large share of the companies in your index fund without any single event you could point to. China, is the largest trading partner of more than 120 countries. Here is the statistic that reframes the entire conversation about American power, and I would bet almost nobody watching this has heard it. China is the top trading partner to more than 120 countries. Let that sit for a second, because the instinct is to assume that means small countries nobody has heard of. It does not. According to Wilson Center analysis, China is the largest trading partner of Japan, of South Korea, of Vietnam and Taiwan, which given proximity is unsurprising, but also of Russia and of Ukraine. In Africa of South Africa and Kenya, in South America of Brazil, in the Middle East of Saudi Arabia, and China is the largest external trading partner of the entire European Union. Now I want to explain why this matters more than almost any military statistic, because it is the mechanism by which influence actually operates day to day. Think about what being someone's largest trading partner means in practice. It means your factories buy their commodities. It means your consumers buy their goods. It means their farmers, their miners, their manufacturers, their port workers, and their trucking companies depend on that relationship for their livelihoods. It means their currency reserves and their tax base are tied to it, which means that when a decision comes up in that country's capital and the choice is between aligning with Washington and preserving that trade relationship, the calculation is not abstract. It is jobs in a specific province, revenue in a specific budget, and a domestic political consequence for the leader who chooses wrong. For most of the last 80 years, that calculation ran the other way. The United States was the market everyone needed access to, and that access was the lever. A hint was frequently sufficient. Not a threat, a hint, because both parties understood the underlying arithmetic. That arithmetic has changed for a large share of the world, and it changed without any announcement, treaty, or conflict. It changed through a few thousand commercial decisions a year, compounded over 2 decades. Now, I want to be careful here because the raw number can mislead, and I do not want you repeating something that gets picked apart. Being the largest trading partner is not the same as being the dominant economic power. The United States remains the largest consumer market on Earth, and the dollar remains the currency in which most of that trade is invoiced and settled, which is its own enormous form of leverage. American capital markets are far deeper than anyone else's, and the ability to access dollar financing is a genuine dependency that runs in America's favor. So the picture is not that America lost and China won. The picture is that the world became genuinely multipolar in a way it has not been since before the Second World War, and that most Americans are still operating on a mental model formed in 1995. And here is the practical implication for you, sitting at home, which is what I actually care about. A world in which influence is distributed rather than concentrated is a world with more friction, more disputes that take longer to resolve, more competing standards, more supply chains that reroute for political rather than economic reasons, more currencies involved in settlement, and more moments where 2 large powers disagree about something and the disagreement is not settled quickly because neither can simply impose an outcome. Friction is expensive. It shows up as higher prices, longer delivery times, and more volatility in everything from energy to food to electronics. That is the version of this that reaches your kitchen table, not tanks, cost and delay. And there is a second-order effect worth naming because it explains something a lot of people have noticed without being able to account for. When influence was concentrated, standards were 2. One set of technical standards, one dominant payment network, one primary settlement currency, one accounting framework, one legal tradition governing most international contracts. That uniformity is invisible, and it is enormously efficient. It means a product designed once can be sold nearly everywhere, and a contract written once is enforceable nearly anywhere. In a multipolar world, standards fragment, You get competing payment systems, competing technical specifications, competing data governance regimes, and competing legal frameworks. Companies have to build twice. Compliance costs multiply, and every one of those duplications is a cost that eventually lands in a price. You have already seen the early version of this in your own life without knowing what you were looking at. Products available in one market but not another. Services that work in some countries and not others. Devices that require different versions for different regions. Software that behaves differently depending on where you are. That is fragmentation, arriving quietly, one regulation at a time. And here is the part that I think is genuinely underappreciated. The single greatest economic gift of the last several decades to ordinary American consumers was not technology. It was the elimination of friction. Cheap shipping, uniform standards, stable currencies, and enforceable contracts made an enormous variety of goods available at prices that would have astonished anyone in 1975. That gift is being partially withdrawn, not by anyone's malice, but as the mechanical consequence of a world with more than one center of gravity. And most Americans are experiencing the withdrawal as inflation, which is only partly what it is. Those military bases used to be protection, and now some countries see them differently. Let me take on a point that I think is genuinely counterintuitive and that explains a great deal about why allied countries are behaving the way they are. The United States maintains military bases across Asia, and for decades those installations were understood by host countries as protection. Having American forces on your soil meant that anyone contemplating action against you had to contemplate action against the United States. That was the deal. It was largely unwritten, and it worked. Now consider what changes if the credibility of the American response comes into question. A base you believe will be defended is an asset. A base you are not certain will be defended is a target. It is a physical concentration of foreign military assets on your territory that makes your territory strategically relevant to a conflict you might otherwise have stayed out of. That is the calculation now being made in a number of capitals, and it is not anti-American sentiment. It is risk management by governments that have to protect their own populations. And there is a specific case worth understanding because it makes the abstraction concrete. The Philippines has a mutual defense treaty with the United States. It is a real treaty with real obligations, comparable in structure to the NATO commitment. Now ask the practical question, if a serious confrontation developed in the South China Sea, would the American public support sending carriers and personnel into harm's way over disputed maritime features most Americans could not locate on a map? That question is not rhetorical, and the honest answer is that nobody knows, which is exactly the problem. A treaty commitment whose activation depends on a domestic political question that nobody can answer in advance is a commitment with an asterisk on it, and every party to it knows that. And this is where I want to be genuinely balanced, because there is a real argument on the other side. The alliance structure has held for 80 years. Treaty commitments have been honored, and there is a reasonable case that the doubt is being overstated, that capability and credibility are being confused, and that a demonstration of resolve would restore the equilibrium quickly. That may be right. But notice that the argument itself concedes the point. If we are debating whether resolve would need to be demonstrated, then we are already in a world where it is not simply assumed. And the assumption was the entire product. Now let me connect this to something that will hit closer to home for a lot of you. There is a real domestic argument in this country that we spend too much abroad while things fall apart here. The potholes, the schools, the bridges, the hospitals. That argument is made constantly, and I understand why. When you are looking at your own county's crumbling roads and then a headline about hundreds of billions spent overseas, the comparison is not unreasonable, and I am not going to pretend it is. But the honest version has a second half that rarely gets said. The security arrangement being described here is also what underwrites the trading system that delivers goods to your store at the prices you are used to. Sea lanes that stay open, insurance that stays affordable, contracts that get honored. That system has costs, and it has genuine beneficiaries other than you, and reasonable people disagree about whether the price is worth it. What is not true is that it is free either way. Withdrawing has costs, and staying has costs, and anybody telling you one of those options is clean is selling you something. The version I would ask you to hold is simply this. The arrangement that has governed your entire adult life is being renegotiated, in public right now, by countries making their own risk calculations. Whatever you think should happen, that is what is happening. When countries get desperate for money, history shows exactly what they reach for. Now let me bring this all the way home to your own savings, because there is a part of this conversation that gets discussed as though it only concerns billionaires, and it absolutely does not. Here is the setup. A government facing enormous debt, rising interest costs, and political pressure eventually has to find money. And the most popular proposals in a great many countries right now involve taxing accumulated wealth rather than income, because that is where the money visibly is. The standard objection is that wealthy people will simply leave. And the standard historical answer to that objection is the part I want you to understand, because it is not speculative. It has all happened before, repeatedly, in many countries. First, governments make the tax retroactive, meaning the law states that you are taxed as of a past date, so that leaving after the announcement does not help you. The obligation attaches to where you were, not to where you go. Second, governments impose exit taxes, meaning that if you renounce or emigrate, you are treated as having sold all your assets on the way out and taxed on the gain. The United States already has a version of this for certain individuals who expatriate. Third, and this is the serious one, governments impose capital controls, meaning limits on how much money you can move out of the country when and for what purpose. Now, I want to be very precise, because I am not predicting any of this, and I do not want anyone doing anything drastic on the strength of a video. None of that is currently in place in the United States for ordinary savers, and a wealth tax has not been enacted here. Wealth taxes are also administratively difficult in ways people underestimate. How do you value a private company, a family farm, an art collection, or an illiquid partnership stake every single year in a way that survives litigation? Several European countries adopted wealth taxes and later repealed them substantially because of exactly these problems. But history is unambiguous that when governments become fiscally desperate, the tools they reach for are the ones that reach the assets that cannot flee. And here is the uncomfortable part for ordinary people. The very wealthy have advisors, structures, jurisdictions, and lawyers. They are the hardest to reach, and they know it. The assets that are easiest to reach are the ones that are visible, registered, and immobile. Your house, your retirement account, your bank deposits. That is not a conspiracy claim. It is simply where the friction is lowest. A real estate parcel cannot be moved to Singapore. A 401k is administered by a custodian who reports to the government. A bank account is already fully visible. So the practical question for someone in their 50s or 60s is not whether a wealth tax passes. It is a much more mundane one. Is my situation resilient to a variety of tax and policy outcomes, or is it optimized for exactly one? And there are boring, legal, entirely conventional answers to that. Diversify tax treatment, not just investments. Most people have everything in one bucket, usually pre-tax retirement accounts, which means one legislative change hits all of it. Having some money in traditional accounts, some in Roth, and some in an ordinary taxable brokerage account means different rules apply to different pieces. That is the tax equivalent of not putting everything in one asset class. Understand that Roth conversions are, among other things, a hedge against future rate increases. You pay the tax at a rate you know rather than a rate you do not. Whether that is right for you depends entirely on your bracket now versus later, which is a conversation for a CPA, not a video. Hold some assets that are not denominated in a single currency, which for most people simply means broad international exposure inside a retirement account rather than anything exotic. Keep some liquidity outside the banking system, meaning a modest amount of physical cash, for reasons that have nothing to do with capital controls and everything to do with power outages and fraud declines. And do not do anything dramatic. The people who get hurt in periods like this are not the ones who failed to move assets offshore. They are the ones who panicked, liquidated, paid enormous taxes and penalties, and bought something they did not understand from someone who was very persuasive. The correct posture is boring resilience, not radical repositioning. This cycle is measurable, which means you can check it yourself. I want to spend a moment on something methodological, because it is the difference between this being a mood and this being an analysis, and it is the part that should make you take it seriously. The framework being described here comes from studying the rise and decline of leading powers over roughly 500 years, across multiple countries. And the crucial claim is that the indicators are objective, not vibes, not opinion, measurable quantities that you can look up. The comparison used is a physical exam. You do not diagnose a patient by asking how they feel about themselves. You measure blood pressure, cholesterol, blood sugar, and weight, and those numbers tell you about the trajectory regardless of the patient's self-image. The equivalent national measurements are these, and I want to list them because you can check every single one. Indebtedness relative to income, whether the debt is growing faster than the economy that services it. Education and human capital. Test scores, degree attainment in productive fields, and how those compare internationally over time. Competitiveness, share of global output, share of high-value manufacturing, patent activity, and whether the country is gaining or losing ground in the industries that will matter next. Military strength relative to rivals, not in absolute terms. Reserve currency status and the share of global transactions conducted in your currency. Internal conflict and political cohesion. Whether the system can still make decisions. And the wealth gap, because extreme concentration reliably precedes internal instability across the entire historical record. Now, here is why I emphasize the measurability. There is an entire industry built on telling frightened people that collapse is imminent and that the solution is a product. Precious metals, subscriptions, courses, newsletters, and the tell is always the same. The claim cannot be checked. It relies on secret knowledge, an anonymous insider, or a chart with no source. The framework I am describing is the opposite. Every input is public. You can pull debt to GDP from the Treasury or the Fed. You can pull education comparisons from the OECD. You can pull reserve currency composition from the IMF. You can pull manufacturing share from the BLS, which means you do not have to trust me, and you should not. You can check, and when you do check, here is roughly what you find. The United States scores extremely well on several measures, particularly innovation, capital markets, higher education at the top end, energy production, and military capability, and it scores poorly and is deteriorating on others, particularly indebtedness, internal political cohesion, wealth concentration, and share of global trade relationships. That is a mixed picture, and I want to give you the mixed picture rather than a dramatic one, because the dramatic version is usually wrong and the mixed version is usually actionable. The framework also says something that gets lost when people summarize it, and it is the most important sentence in the whole thing. The strength of each country going forward will be determined by how it takes care of itself, how it educates its population, how it spends its money, how it manages itself. Those are internal variables, which means the outcome is not determined by China or by any adversary. It is determined domestically by choices, and the greatest risk is erosion from within through debt and internal conflict rather than defeat from outside. That is a genuinely hopeful framing if you take it seriously, because internal variables are the ones a country can actually change. You cannot occupy a country of 90 million people, and every empire has learned this the same way. Let me address the military question directly, because there is an assumption buried in a lot of the commentary about this that history does not support. The assumption is that overwhelming capability translates into control, that if a country is willing to spend enough and accept enough casualties, it can impose an outcome. The historical record on that is remarkably consistent and remarkably discouraging. Iran has roughly 90 million people. They live there. They will continue to live there regardless of what any outside power does, and their descendants will live there after that. That is the arithmetic that every occupying force in history has eventually run into. You can destroy infrastructure. You can defeat a conventional army, sometimes very quickly. What you cannot easily do is control a large hostile population over time, because the cost of control scales with population and duration while the political will of the occupying democracy decays with both. America learned this in Vietnam. It learned it again in Iraq and Afghanistan, at a cost of trillions of dollars and enormous human loss across 2 decades, with outcomes that almost nobody would describe as a success. The Soviet Union learned it in Afghanistan, and the experience contributed to its collapse. Britain learned it across an empire, and the Chinese strategic tradition, interestingly, largely never attempted it in the same way. The classical text everyone quotes, The Art of War, treats winning without fighting as the highest achievement, and the historical tribute system operated on economic and ceremonial dependency rather than occupation. Whether one admires that or not, it is a genuinely different theory of how power works, and it is worth understanding that the country most often discussed as a rival has a strategic culture that does not center on holding foreign territory. Now apply this to the chokepoint question, because this is where it becomes concrete. Suppose the objective is control of a strait, not regime change, not occupation, just keeping a waterway open. That sounds narrow and achievable, but think about what it actually requires. It is not an operation with an end date. Keeping a strait open against a hostile population on its shore means maintaining a force posture there indefinitely, absorbing continuous low-level attrition, at ongoing cost forever, with no moment at which anyone declares victory and goes home. And then the question that follows is the one that changes everything. If you commit to doing that there, are you committing to doing it everywhere? Because every other actor watching will draw conclusions from your answer either way. That is the trap. Enforcing the commitment is enormously expensive and open-ended. Declining to enforce it teaches the world something permanent. There is no cheap option, and both roads lead to a changed world order. I want to be careful not to turn this into a political argument, because I do not think this is fundamentally about which party is in office. Presidents of both parties have faced this same structural bind for 25 years, and the pattern of intervention followed by extended stalemate, followed by withdrawal, has repeated under very different leaders with very different rhetoric. That consistency across administrations is itself evidence that the cause is structural rather than personal. It is what happens when a democracy with a 2-year electoral cycle and a casualty-averse public takes on open-ended commitments in places where the local population does not want them there. And the practical takeaway for you is this. When you hear about a decisive action or a swift resolution in a conflict of this type, apply a heavy discount. The historical base rate for swift resolutions in occupations of populous countries is close to zero, and the base rate is the only forecasting tool anybody actually has. Semiconductors are not the only choke point, and the others are already being used. I want to widen this beyond chips, because focusing on Taiwan alone gives you an incomplete picture of how dependency actually works in the modern economy. The pattern to understand is this. Over 3 decades, global production was optimized relentlessly for cost, and optimizing for cost naturally produces concentration, because whichever location becomes cheapest attracts more and more production until it dominates. Efficiency and fragility are the same thing viewed from different angles. The result is a global economy with a surprising number of single points of failure, and most of them are invisible until they break. Rare earth elements are the clearest example. These are the materials that go into magnets for electric motors, wind turbines, hard drives, and a great deal of defense hardware. They are not actually geologically rare, which is the confusing part. What is concentrated is the processing. Separating and refining rare earths is chemically difficult, environmentally messy, and was largely abandoned by Western countries because it was cheaper to let somebody else do it. China now dominates that processing capacity, and export controls in that sector have already been used as leverage in trade disputes. Pharmaceutical ingredients are another. A large share of the active ingredients in American generic drugs and the precursor chemicals behind them are produced in a small number of facilities overseas. That means the medications an enormous number of Americans take daily depend on supply chains that are neither domestic nor diversified. And unlike consumer goods, you cannot simply do without them for a quarter. Fertilizer is a third, and it is the one that ties directly to food. Nitrogen fertilizer is made from natural gas, potash comes from a handful of countries, and phosphate from fewer still. Disruptions there do not show up immediately. They show up a season later in yields, and then a season after that in prices. Shipping itself is a choke point category. A relatively small number of straits, canals, and ports handle a disproportionate share of world trade, and the insurance market that underwrites the vessels can effectively close a route without any military action at all, simply by declining to write coverage. And transformers, which almost nobody thinks about, are a genuine bottleneck for the electrical grid. Large power transformers have long lead times and limited manufacturing capacity worldwide, which is why grid operators worry about them and why a serious grid event is harder to recover from than people assume. Now, what do you do with this information? Because I do not want to leave you with a list of things to be afraid of and nothing to act on. 2 things. First, understand which of these touch your household directly, and build modest depth in exactly those. If you or a family member depends on a maintenance medication, that is your personal choke point. And the appropriate response is not fear. It is asking your physician about 90-day supplies and staying ahead on refills rather than filling on the last day. That single habit converts a supply disruption from a crisis into an inconvenience. If you heat with a delivered fuel, your choke point is delivery scheduling, and the response is automatic delivery and a full tank in the off-season. If you eat, your exposure is food prices with a lag, and the response is shelf depth in staples bought at current prices. Second, and more broadly, notice what this pattern implies about the direction of costs. Every one of these dependencies is now being partially unwound for security reasons rather than economic ones. Reshoring, friendshoring, stockpiling, redundant capacity, all of it is more expensive than the arrangement it replaces. That is the whole point of it. So the reasonable expectation for the next decade is not a return to the price levels of 2019, it is a structurally higher cost base for manufactured goods, offset partially by productivity gains in exchange for a supply system that breaks less catastrophically. Whether that trade is worth it is a genuine policy debate. But if you are planning a retirement or a household budget on the assumption that prices revert to what you remember, the historical and structural evidence is against you, and building the plan around a higher cost base is simply prudent rather than pessimistic. A regional world is coming, and here is what that means for your household. Let me finish by translating all of this into what it actually means for an ordinary American household, because geopolitics is entertainment unless it changes what you do. The most likely outcome described here is not a great war. It is a regional world, meaning influence organized around a few centers rather than one, with the Americas forming one sphere and the region around China forming another, and development happening substantially within those spheres rather than across a single integrated global system. That is the good scenario. It is the one that avoids catastrophe. But it is not the world you have lived in, and it has specific consequences. First, expect goods to cost more and supply chains to be less reliable. The last 30 years optimized global production for cost above everything else, and it worked spectacularly. Manufacturing went wherever it was cheapest, and the system delivered astonishing abundance to American consumers. A regional world optimizes for security instead. Production moves closer to the consumer, or to politically aligned countries, and closer means more expensive. That is not a temporary disruption. It is a structural change in the price level of manufactured goods, and it is already underway. Second, expect more volatility around anything with a choke point. Energy, semiconductors, pharmaceutical ingredients, rare earth minerals, fertilizer, shipping. Each one has a small number of physical or political bottlenecks, and in a more contested world, those bottlenecks are pressed more often. Third, expect the currency to matter more than it used to. A world with more competing centers is a world with more currency movement, and currency movement changes the price of everything imported, silently, without any tariff or announcement. So what do you actually do? And I want these to be things a normal person can act on, not advice for a hedge fund. Reduce fixed obligations. In a more volatile environment, the household with low required monthly outflow has options, and the household with high required outflow has none. Debt is the mechanism that converts volatility into disaster. Build a genuine cash reserve sized to 6 months of your actual floor rather than 3 months of your lifestyle, and keep it somewhere earning something. Diversify what your money is denominated in, which for most people means ordinary broad international exposure inside a retirement account. Own some things that are useful rather than only things that are financial. Practical skills, tools, depth in your pantry. Not because society ends, but because a household that can absorb a supply disruption without panic is a household that does not have to make expensive decisions under pressure. Pay attention to what your own community actually produces. Regionalization is not only a national phenomenon, it happens at the level of towns, and the places that can make, grow, fix, and process things locally will do materially better than the places that only consume. And here is the last one, and I think it is the most important. Do not organize your life around the assumption that any of this resolves quickly. The historical framework is explicit that these transitions unfold over decades, not months. Anyone telling you a specific date is guessing, which means the correct response is not to brace for an event. It is to become durable in a general way, so that a wide range of outcomes are survivable. Something did change, and I do believe it was permanent, because what changed was knowledge, and knowledge does not reverse. The world learned something about the limits of American power that it did not previously know, and the countries that learned it are already adjusting. But permanent is not the same as fatal. Britain after Suez went on for 70 more years, and is a wealthy country today. It just stopped being the center, and it had to learn to be something else, and the transition was managed badly in some decades, and well in others. That is the actual choice in front of this country, not whether to remain the sole dominant power, which was probably never sustainable, and which the historical record says nobody has ever sustained, but whether the adjustment is handled with clear eyes or with denial. And the same is true for you personally. You cannot control the world order. You can control how much debt you carry, how many skills you have, how much cash sits in reserve, and how many people would show up if you called. Get those 4 things right, and a very wide range of futures becomes survivable. Take care of yourselves out there. And one last thought before you go. The people who came through the last great transition intact, the one Britain went through after 1956, were not the ones who predicted it correctly. Almost nobody did. They were the ones who were not overextended when it arrived, who had skills that remained useful under a different arrangement, and who lived somewhere with people who looked out for each other. None of that required knowing the future. It required not betting everything on one version of it.